Okay, so it's John Robb interviewing Stephen Wilson here about probably lots of things we never get around to talking about because there's lots condensed in here. But let's start with the current album, the overview, because this is what we talked about last time. I mean, I guess let's start with the concept of it. The concept kind of sort of extrapolates into the music, doesn't it? So did the concept come first?
Yeah, it did. I mean, I don't normally have such a clear idea what I'm going to write about when I start a new record. I kind of fumble around and I have a few musical ideas and I sort of sing nonsense lyrics, And this time it was the complete opposite. I knew exactly what the album was going to be about. I had this kind of whole sort of map in my head, this whole kind of journey mapped out in my head. I was going to start off on Earth and I was going to end up at the other end of the cosmos by the end of the record. And I was going to go on this journey in between. And that is very unusual for me. And so it was great to have such a strong sense of what I wanted to do right from the very beginning. So this concept of the overview, or, this idea of looking back at us and this planet that we live on from outer space, and that word perspective, having a kind of perspective on what it means to be alive and what it means to be on this pale blue dot floating in the cosmos amongst trillions and trillions of other planets. And that was both a sort of, very strong starting point lyrically, but also musically in terms of what I wanted to evoke through the music. Yeah.
I mean, the actual concept of it itself. I mean, I saw some interviews you've done, and the idea, the utter insignificance of everything, is quite
Mm.
inspirational, actually, isn't it?
Well, I think it is. It's funny. A lot of people have said to me, "Oh, that's a very negative. It's a very negative way to look at things, isn't it?" And I don't see it as negative. I think it's actually quite a positive thing to acknowledge just how random and insignificant the gift of life really is, and therefore to approach it from that sort of perspective of, enjoy the ride.
Mhm.
Enjoy the ride. Make the most of it because it isn't the universe really doesn't care about your little, existence, your life. It's over in a moment. And so in that sense, it's kind of liberating to kind of, at least I feel, to acknowledge that to yourself and say, well, if my life means nothing, the least I can do is kind of make the most of it and try and find something that makes me feel like it has some worth. So I've always thought of it, since the beginning of the writing process, I always thought of it from a very positive sort of angle rather than a negative one.
I mean, how do you actually start putting that into music? I mean, yeah, you got the concept's great. It's a fascinating concept. And it was one of those things you could actually just sit there and think about forever. Or do you go and pick up a guitar? Or does it sort of turn itself into musical themes in your head?
Well, I think one of the things that I knew pretty early on was that I just wanted a continuous piece of music. So that's that's quite different from me, say, from my last few records, which have been, you know, 10, 11, 12 self-contained songs, all of which create their own little musical universe and have their own kind of lyrical, concept underlying them. And this time around, I thought, you know what? If you're going to deal with something so massive, so mind-blowingly, inconceivably beyond our comprehension, it makes sense to try and write something that is a continuous piece of music, in grand classic progressive rock style in that respect, a great conceptual flow of music. And I think once I knew that I was going to be writing, well, essentially I had it in my mind as two sides of a vinyl record. So it became two long pieces of music. As soon as I kind of knew that, that took me down a different musical path of coming up with just one or two musical ideas, one or two musical motifs, which I could then explore in lots of different ways across a long piece of music. So the first thing I remember doing was sit down at the piano and coming up with this sort of 12 note theme with this kind of bass line that went with it. And I thought, well, yeah, you know what? What are all the different ways I can kind of look at that theme across a long piece of music, which actually is more of a sort of classical music approach, like a symphonic approach to writing music, to explore a theme through different kind of fugues and different rhythms and different tempos and different feels. So that was quite different for me this time. So the first thing I had was that 12 note piano theme actually.
I mean, and did the music have to suggest, some of the ideas and the images that you have in your head when you think about the subject?
Yeah, I wanted it to. So this theme I came up with, the reason I came up with a particular theme was that I wanted a theme that felt like it was constantly in a, it had a feeling of constantly being in a state of flux. I'm not explaining this very well. I wanted it to feel like it was constantly ascending and constantly growing and expanding. So the theme I came up with has this bass line which continues to ascend. And it's that shepherd tone thing, that shepherd tones thing where it feels like it's always in a state of ascending and rising higher and higher. Of course, it's an illusion, but that was something I wanted to kind of reflect this idea of the universe being this endless and endlessly expanding expanse. So yeah, the musical theme at least in my mind kind of reflects that constant state of expansion.
And also, you made a film to go as well, which we saw, didn't we? I mean, obviously, we did the
Mm.
last event in that really strange 5.1 cinema, right? I thought it was going to be like a really posh cinema in town, but it's like this kind of very cool, but very odd cinema on the edge of town.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a bit great. It's funny enough, I'd done it at the IMAX in London the night before, which is like couldn't be more different.
Yeah.
This big sort of fancy, I don't want to say corporate because BFI is not a corporation, but you know what I mean, very sort of elaborate. And then turning up at that little kind of grungy boutique art cinema was the complete antithesis of that in a way. But yeah, it was very cool, very cool. I enjoyed that night very much.
Yeah, and the film itself, was that to expand on the themes of the music or to match themes or just something quite different as well? Because I mean, one thing's about space is this chaos, and I mean, you can't really describe
Mm.
something, can you, that there's that vast and that chaotic.
I think the film came about for pragmatic reasons, really. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, going back to the earlier albums where you'd have like 10 songs, and the record company will always say to you, we want to make two or three videos, and they'll be like the flag bearers for the album. We'll release them 2 or 3 months before the album, and they'll be the concept of a single doesn't really exist anymore, but what they call a, kind of an instant grat track now, something to give fans an idea of what's coming. And it just didn't make sense with this record because this record is just these two long pieces. And I was like very, very adamant early on. No, I don't want to take little pieces out of the jigsaw, little pieces out of the story and present them to the listeners out of context 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks before the album. I want them to hear the album from beginning to end in the way they'd watch a movie. And so for that reason, it became a consideration. Well, how else are we going to, represent the album on social media? How else are we going to promote the album through YouTube and all these other channels that you have to kind of engage with now? So I thought to myself, well, why don't I take the budgets I would normally have had to make 3 or 4 videos for 3 or 4 singles from the album? Why don't I just put all that money together, give it to one filmmaker and say, there you go, knock yourself out, make a movie. And that's what I did. So I gave it to this great young filmmaker called Miles Scarron, and I said, I sort of talked with him through some of the themes of the record and roughly where I was coming from. And he, bless him, went away and was with a lot more sort of scientific rigor than I ever had and researched a lot more about the universe and the science of it and kind of developed that into this 42-minute film. So I learned a lot from watching his movie, stuff that I hadn't really properly researched.
What kind of things did you learn?
So, for example, I'm talking in the movie about this idea of perspective, and I'm referencing the fact there are all these trillions of galaxies and all these trillions of planets and trillions of other suns. But I didn't really go out and find out a lot more about these different universes, different galaxies, different suns. He really did, he researched it all. So I found myself learning a lot more just about the universes and some of the other galaxies in the universe. I think I was approaching it more from that. When I was writing it, I was approaching it more from the point of view of this simple idea of cosmic vertigo, being a human being lost in this vast cosmos, But of course, he was having to visualize a lot of these other planets and other galaxies and other cosmic phenomena. So he had to actually go and find out about them and what they would look like, how they might appear in filmic terms, in cinematic terms. So it was a whole different level of scientific rigor for him.
I mean, one of the things I found fascinating about the universe, because it is so mind-boggling, it is actually quite a psychedelic experience thinking about it. It seems to set off the same parts of your brain that psychedelic experiences would. I mean, did you find that as well? Just because it's like, phew.
It's yeah, I think the thing is that when you start actually engaging with some of the numbers and some of the facts and figures, it's almost like our brains can't quite hold the ideas
Mm.
in our minds because they are so ridiculous. They are so ridiculously mind-boggling, the numbers, like that statistic. I can't remember the ones that we talked about when we did the Q&A at the Manchester event, but some of the statistics, like for every grain of sand on Earth, there are a billion planets in the universe.
Mm. Mm.
Things like that. I mean, they're almost inconceivably huge numbers. Um, and when you start looking into not only that thing about space and distance, but also about time, the fact that the amount of time has passed between a star that we look at in the sky transmitting the light and that light actually arriving at our eye and actually seeing that star in the sky is thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. We're seeing an image of something that happened thousands, if not millions of years ago. So when you start to engage with those ideas, not only about distance and the number of planets and the number of galaxies, but also that thing about time and the speed of light, that is also mind blowing to me. Yeah, and as you say, truly, truly mind expanding and psychedelic in that sense.
It's the stuff they can't see that's got me fascinated now. That's they're the stars that are close to us, and they don't even exist anymore. But beyond that,
Exactly.
nobody has any
Exactly.
idea what's out there.
Yeah, I mean those stars long ago sort of imploded and became dark matter. I mean, you're absolutely right. That stuff is just so fascinating to me, but almost impossible to really. To, sorry, my dogs are making a noise. Guys, thank you. Daddy's doing an interview. Um, Almost impossible to hold in the mind, really.
I mean, once you get sort of invested in this, I guess that this has been, like for all of us, like a lifelong interest, really. But when you go the deep dive, make a record about, if you get really immersed in the subject matter, is that kind of change you as well? Do you find this is like a sudden left-hand turn in the way you think about life and music and creativity and everything, really?
I think as I've got older, I've constantly found myself reminding myself more about what's important, and it's so easy. And I think we did talk about this, didn't we? It's so easy to become um, obsessed and bound up with things that really don't matter. And social media, particularly, that we all live in the age now of social media, where we're constantly bombarded with the noise of opinion. And that kind of belligerence that social media tends to accentuate, which is that seeing things in very black and white terms. And we're constantly bombarded. I mean, like as a musician, you're a musician too, so you must find this too, is that when I started making music in the early 90s, when I started releasing records in the early 90s, the only real feedback I had was from professional journalists reviewing my record. And when I went on tour, I would sometimes meet fans after the gigs, before the gigs, who would tell me what they thought of my record. And that was it, really. That was the only feedback I had. So, in a sense, although it didn't feel like it at the time, we were kind of existing in a vacuum where we just made our music to please ourselves. And somewhere down the line, we kind of got to know whether a record had really resonated or not. But it might be 6 months or a year later. And now we live in a world within 10 minutes of me putting some new content. I hate that word, but I'm going to use it anyway. Some new content online. I can read 1,000 opinions, 10,000 opinions, 10,000 reviews, and most of those reviews will be expressed as fact, something else the human race is very good at. We're very good at expressing our opinions in the form of facts. This sucks. This is amazing. And I will see all of those different opinions expressed within the space of 10 minutes of me uploading this content. And that's a very hard thing sometimes to deal with because it's very hard not to take those things very personally if they're negative, particularly. So I find it's very important these days to constantly be in a state of reminding yourself about this idea of perspective. What's important to you? What's important to me is to make something I'm proud of and to something that has integrity and that has not been made in a sense, that kind of artistic conundrum that is art has to be really made in a very kind of selfish way, in a way, doesn't it? I mean, I've always felt like there's a difference between art and entertainment. Entertainment is something that kind of identifies what people want and tries to give it to them. And art, without wishing to sound pretentious, is something that the creator feels compelled to make in a way to please themselves. And that doesn't mean that you don't try very hard to then share it with as many people as possible. But I think that's the important difference for me, is that you make it ultimately because you believe in it and to please yourself. And to see that constantly reflected back at you, sometimes in a negative way, in the mirror of social media, I find myself constantly having to remind myself that that is not important. So in a way, I don't know if that's a very long answer to your question. In a way, I feel like, yes, an album about perspective is very much an important thing that affects all of us in the social media age.
It's interesting you talk about that because do you think your role as an artist has changed? Not particularly the way you do it or create the art, but in this kind of modern kind of battlefield, is it distractive, or do you find that you can actually sort of shut out the noise and concentrate on what you do? Or is it just a mixture of both?
Well, I have shut it out because I deliberately kind of talking about social media. I deliberately don't read anything that anyone writes about me. I don't even read interviews, but I do interviews. I don't read them back. I don't read reviews. I told my manager and record company, do not send me reviews, even the good ones. I don't want to read them because in a way, it's fantastic to know that you've got a great review, but in a way, that's not something I feel like it's not something I should be reading. It's good enough for me to know that there's been a good review. I don't need to read exactly how someone has analysed it or kind of engaged with it. So I do manage to shut myself off. What I think has changed, and which I can't ignore, is not the creation of the art necessarily, but the way that it finds its way out into the world. And a lot of that, I think, is purely down to the sheer proliferation of music and content and art now. So that statistic that, all the music released in 1989, the same amount of music comes out every single day in 2025.
Yeah.
Things like talk about mind-blowing statistics. There's another one for you. So 89 is roughly when I started professionally. It was actually a couple of years later, but that's about the time I started making music. And so to understand that in my career, in my lifetime, or the sort of span of my career, music has proliferated. The amount of people making music and releasing it online has proliferated to that extent of 365 times more every day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you just think to yourself, well, how does anything ever connect with anyone anymore?
Mm.
And I don't have an answer to that question. It is a rhetorical question. But of course, I try everything I can. I try everything I can to share my music. But it's so hard now it's so hard to get people's attention for more than a few moments. I mean, you know that. I know that. We're kind of from an earlier generation when it felt much simpler. There was so much less music being released. You understood who the gatekeepers were. You understood who the people were that you needed to get to like you and like what you did in order to sell records. I mean, I don't even understand sales figures anymore, or charts anymore. It all seems very confusing. Somebody that does extraordinarily well on social media, sorry, on streaming services, but sells no physical product, and vice versa. I mean, I do very well selling physical products, but my streaming figures are terrible. And I think it's, of course, it's to do with the demographic of my audience. They're a bit older. They're like me. They still like physical products. They're quite wary of streaming and Spotify and the like. So I understand that, but it's a very confusing music industry. It seems very complicated to me.
And yet somehow you seem to have thrived in everything that if someone's going to give us some advice on how to survive in the music business, they would not say, do like that guy is over there. like 42-minute long concert albums about space with
Well,
no
no, I mean
singles on
that's it,
it.
and I think in a way, I think in your question is the answer because what I've come to the conclusion, the conclusion I've come to, sorry, is that in a world where there is too much content, there is too much music, accentuate what's different about what you do. Find the thing that is different about what you do, the quirks, and kind of home in on them and double down on them, because at least that way you've got a chance of standing out from all the other noise. And I say that because the conventional wisdom was always with the industry was to kind of adapt or compromise what you did to achieve success, whether that be releasing, singles that Radio One would playlist, or cutting your song to the length that radio would go for, all that stuff. And I did all that. I played all those games in the 90s. I played all those games in the noughties too. And I think now none of that works anyway, and all bets are off. So you might as well just double down and do what the fuck you do, and really try and find what is in some ways counterintuitively different about what you do. I mean, here I am, I've just released a 42-minute concept album with 2 tracks, and I've had probably the most successful album, one of the most successful albums of my career, in terms of reviews, chart placings. Amazing, amazing. So there's a lesson, kind of. So what I would say to people is do what you love. Do what you love. Find what's special about what you do. Find what's unique about what you do, and really home in on that. And then you might have a chance of a career.
But even saying that, so, I mean, you sort of home in on what would ostensibly seem like to another person very diverse kind of areas. On one level, people think of you being like a prog artist, but there's also Donna Summer. There's kind of future disco of what it was at the time. There's post punk. There's punk. There's so many. People didn't really think about this stuff too much, but think of being very conflicting musics that somehow you make sense of, and you even break out of your own genre, which is fantastic. Sort of post
Right.
genre.
Yeah, and I think, the album even has the section on it, which I think is my Orteca section. I think what I've stopped doing is being self-conscious about my influences, my inspirations, and the way I blend them. I just do it. And I don't think anymore about what logically should belong in a single piece of music. I just mix it up, and I'm not thinking too hard, and I'm not thinking too self-consciously about, oh, you can't put that in the same song as that. I don't do that anymore. I just let it all come out in a very kind of intuitive, unself-conscious way. But then I think to myself, wasn't that what progressive rock was anyway?
Mm.
Because if you go back to the sort of golden age of progressive rock, say starting in the late 60s with albums like King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King, and then moving through into the 70s and having albums like Dark Side of the Moon. If you kind of Dark Side of the Moon is a classic example, probably the most famous conceptual album of all time. And yet on that record, you will hear electronic music. You will hear gospel music in The Great Gig in the Sky. You will hear funk music in Money. And yet the whole album has this kind of grand conceptual sweep to it. And I think that's what happens when you have musicians that are not thinking about what they're doing. They're just doing. And
Mm.
I always thought that's what progressive rock should be anyway.
Yeah, it can't be
making
progressive.
making kind of new hybrids of music. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, it can't be progressive if it's repeating what it did in 1975, can it?
Well, exactly, and it's kind of counterintuitive to say so. I think in that sense, although perhaps sometimes I kind of push my fans around a bit because I do things that they're not expecting. Like you thought I was a prog rock artist. Here's 5 minutes of pure electronica, or here's 5 minutes of disco. But you know what? Progressive rock fans are a little bit more open-minded than I think they give themselves credit for sometimes. And a lot of them, not all of them, I grant you, but a lot of them seem to go with me on this journey. And that's fantastic. And I think that, like you say, that's what progressive should mean and should be about. Yeah.
I think because you come from a different generation, obviously than the classic progressive rock, that you have a different way of looking at that, and also a different way of accessing it in the first place. When you started listening to prog, I'm guessing when you're probably 14, 15, in the mid to late 80s, you're listening to it almost as a historical document, aren't you? You're not listening to it in real time, you listen to it as a thing, and it sounds great, but your link to it is different than the purveyors of it at the time.
Very much. And I think that's because I grew up in the early 80s. I mean, I became a teenager in 1980. So I'm literally discovering music throughout the 80s as a teenager. And because of that, the music that all my friends were listening to wasn't Hawkwind, Yes, Pink Floyd, Roxy Music, David Bowie. It wasn't. I went back and discovered all that stuff and loved it. But my music was Joy Division, The Cure, The Specials, The Jam, The Police, Tears for Fears, OMD, all this stuff. But actually, one of the things I've kind of drawn a line between those two things because, in fact, I did a compilation for Demon Music a couple of years ago based on this idea that actually a lot of that music now seems like a continuation of progressive rock ideals or art rock ideals. If you listen to bands like Wire, Magazine, Cocteau Twins, A Certain Ratio, to me, XTC, to me, it's very much a continuation of the progressive rock aesthetic and the progressive rock approach. It's less about technical ability and musicianship and more about ideas, but in its own way, it's just as pretentious, and I mean that in the best possible sense of the word, because I love pretentious. It's just as pretentious and reaching as that earlier generation. And I think that's where I didn't really see the difference, perhaps, that maybe some of the purists see. To me, Joy Division is just as portentous and epic as the most, pretentious progressive rock album from 1972. And that's what I love about it.
Do you think prog, in its set in a sense, probably not by its own fault, but had not an image problem, but but it wasn't explained properly. A lot of people do think, oh, it's all about being a virtuoso and it's too complex, but often it was actually really simple, wasn't it? I mean, Hawkwind cannot just be one riff for 25 minutes, can't it? You know,
Yeah.
but
And
somehow
Floyd.
they've rewritten the story here and missed out loads of really good stuff, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And Floyd were always very simple and actually relatively, not the most incredible musicians, but had the ideas and had that kind of. I think Hawkwind and Floyd had a lot in common because they both came out of psychedelia. And so they had that kind of psychedelic aesthetic where sometimes it was about sound design. It wasn't about it wasn't about the playing or the technical ability. It was more about the sound world and the sound design. And to be honest, those two bands from that generation are probably still my favorites, perhaps for that reason. Maybe add Crimson into the mix too. I always liked a slightly darker edge, so I loved Vandergraaf and Crimson and Magma, perhaps a little bit more than I liked the Genesis and the ELP. I think I was less inclined to the bands that had the more kind of technical virtuosic thing going on. Um, I guess that influence from classical music or musicians that had been trained classically making that kind of. And I do like a lot of that stuff now, but I think early on it wasn't the stuff that initially kind of appealed to me. It was the creation of a sense of otherness. And what had more of a sense of otherness than Hawkwind at their peak? They completely had that sense of otherness. And the ultimate space rock band as well, lest we forget, very topical in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, they've been out there in the universe longer than most
Still
stars.
doing it. Yeah, still. I think they've just released a new. I think Dave Brock is like 80 something now, isn't he?
Or I think he still looks exactly the same.
He looks exactly the same. He's got the same moustache. Yeah, bless
I
him.
mean, is this the same sort of things you'd be getting for, say, Donna Summer as well? You know, because being futuristic, almost like sci-fi disco, very rhythmic, repetitive. Um, for a lot of people, it tends to be a completely different form of music, but in a weird way, not that dissimilar, is it?
No, and of course, a lot of those, a lot of people forget a lot of those early disco records by Donna Summer, the Giorgio Moroder records, some of those records by people like Cerrone, they would have like sidelong tracks,
Mm.
like 16, 17 minute. I remember that my mum had Love to Love You Baby by Donna Summer, and the first side of that record was a 16-minute long version of the title track, which went through all these different kind of sections and moods. And I'm thinking, well, where did they get this from? And of course, they got it from Giorgio Moroder. Now, if you read interviews with him, he'll admit he got it from listening to things like Floyd.
Mm.
Uh, the idea that you could explore, you could take the listener on a journey across and then of course the next generation is you have people like Trevor Horn who grew up listening to Giorgio Moroder records, making records for Propaganda and Frankie Goes to Hollywood and in the
Yes.
early 80s, and again taking that idea of conceptual music and making the album a kind of conceptual statement, and together with people like Paul Morley, of course, giving the sort of the framework around. But that first side of Welcome to the Pleasure Dome is a 16-minute long track. So
Mm.
you kind of see that lineage really right up to this day, hopefully with an album like Overview, feeling like the next step in that kind of lineage.
Mm. So, because we've only got about 5 minutes left, so the upcoming tour, what can we expect from the tour? What are you going to be playing? What are you going to be doing here?
So I'm doing the whole of the new record as the second half of the show, and with the film. So the other sort of pragmatic element of making the film was knowing that I'd be able to use it in the show. So I have a massive screen at the back of the stage, and the second half of the show will be the overview from beginning to end with the film. And then the first half of the show is just really a journey through my back catalogue, again with a lot of visuals. I have a fantastic band with me, all better musicians than me. I always subscribe to that Frank Zappa thing. He said, always be the worst musician in your own band. So I am absolutely the worst musician in my band. So I have the ideas and I employ these incredible musicians to be able to play it for me. Not coming back to our earlier discussion, not that it's all about virtuosity. It isn't. Very much about atmosphere, and just trying again take the people that come to the concert on some kind of trip, psychedelic trip across the 2 hours of the concert.
So it's very much framed within psychedelia.
I think it's a funny thing. I've never been that interested in drugs, but I've always loved the psychedelic aesthetic. I love that idea of being able to tap into what I think of as the logic of dreams, making connections that you wouldn't logically make. And to me, that's what psychedelic really is. It's I know it's partly comes out of drug culture and LSD and all that stuff, but to me, David Lynch was always psychedelic. Stanley Kubrick's 2001 is psychedelic because there's this kind of logic of dreams going on in those kind of the oeuvres of those directors. And I think again, that's what I always responded to in music, whether it was Captain Beefheart or Pink Floyd or Tangerine Dream or Wire or whatever it was. There was something about that music that had the logic of dreams in it. And that's what I always think of as psychedelic at the end of the day. Stockhausen, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the serious German composer, to me, that's completely psychedelic because it's so off the wall and it's about ideas and it's about mind expanding ideas. I love it.
I like the records are one thing, but the live space is definitely taking the audience on a trip, I imagine, isn't it? In every way
Well,
possible.
absolutely. Yeah, and I have surround as well. So I have speakers behind the audience. So there are certain sounds that come from behind the audience, which kind of all adds to that sense of otherness and mind expansion. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, we've got about 1 minute left. I hate it when it cuts off in the middle of a quote. Well, thanks for your time, Stephen. Yeah. Yeah.
Pleasure, John.